Steve Jobs is one of the most revolutionary men in history, from his nuanced contributions like computer fonts and the mouse to his decisive marks with Pixar and, of course, Apple. Over the last several years after Steve's death, the wealth of tech moguls have soared as they have profited tens of billions every single year. More importantly, Apple stock itself has grown 81% in 2020 alone. So, how much would Steve Jobs be worth today? Well, starting off, let's take a look at Steve Jobs' Apple stake over the years. Steve Jobs started Apple with Steve Wozniak way back in 1976. But considering that they didn't have too much capital to invest into the company, and the fact that equity had to be shared with other key voices in the company as well, Steve Jobs started with a modest 26% stake in Apple after their first funding round in 1977. By 1985, however, this stake would be watered down to less than half of that at 11%. At this point, for a variety of reasons, Steve Jobs would actually quit/be fired from Apple. He says he quit, but many reports suggest that he was fired. Either way though, he left Apple in 1985. And Steve Jobs, being Steve Jobs, decided that it would be a great idea to sell his entire stake as a symbolic move that he didn't need Apple. Now, Steve Jobs would return to Apple in 1997, and during that time, though Apple did have a few notable launches, the company was experiencing a strong downtrend and was on the brink of bankruptcy. Considering this, you would think that Steve Jobs made the right move, as he should be able to buy back in for a cheaper price than when he left. But this was during the dot-com bubble, so despite Apple being in a worse-off position, their stock price was actually much higher. When Steve Jobs left Apple in September of 1985, Apple stock was only worth 7 cents apiece. He wouldn't become CEO again until September of 1997. However, he would become significantly financially invested in the company once again during December of 1996. At the time, Apple shares were actually worth 21 cents per share. Granted, these are both literally pennies in comparison to their stock price today. Nonetheless, the move out and back in heavily diluted Steve's position in the company. When he left, he was able to cash out of $21.43 million, which he put towards a series of investments, including a company called Next. Next Inc. was a computer and software company that Steve hoped would grow large enough to even compete against Apple one day. Though the company never grew that large, it would allow for Steve Jobs' re-entry into Apple, as Apple would buy Next in December of 1996. Apple bought the company for a solid $400 million, but Steve's stake in the company only netted him a mere 1.5 million Apple shares. That might sound like a lot, and it is. However, in comparison to his original stake, this was nothing. To put that in perspective, let's take a look at how many shares that would be today. Since 1997, Apple has had a total of 4 stock splits, which has led each Apple share today to be worth 112 times less in terms of company ownership when compared with the shares in 1997. As a result, Steve Jobs' 1.5 million shares in 1997 would be the same as 168 million shares today. Though that is a lot of shares, if Steve Jobs didn't sell his shares in a fit of rage in 1985, he would have had 1.881 billion shares. So, that fiasco reduced Steve's ownership 11x, bringing down his ownership percentage to a little less than 1%. But that's not where the story ended either. See, at this point, Steve Jobs was simply financially invested in the company, and though he held an advisory role, he wasn't CEO just yet. In early 1997, Apple would actually try to appoint a man named Joe Amelio as the CEO. Steve Jobs was not a fan of this move, and he would sell his entire stake again to protest this appointment. Steve Jobs would get his way, and Joe Amelio's appointment would be cancelled. After this, Steve Jobs would be made CEO again in September of 1997. As his first and only compensation, Steve would receive 5.5 million 2011 shares, which is the same as 1.375 million 1997 shares. With that, Steve Jobs had successfully watered down his stake another 10%. But as he would so often say, he didn't join Apple again for the money, and this would be clear over the next 14 years. Steve Jobs took a $1 salary for the rest of his time at Apple, and this was a true $1 salary, as he received no further stock compensation as many CEOs today receive. From all of this, we can derive that Steve was left with about 5.5 million shares of Apple at the time of his death, or the same as 154 million shares today. That translates to 2.034 billion at the time of his death, or 20.43 billion today. But wait, there's something wrong with this math. At the time of Steve's death, his net worth was actually 10.2 billion, meaning that there's an $8.2 billion discrepancy. So where did this money come from? Well, ironically, though Steve Jobs was basically synonymous with Apple and iPhone today, 80% of his net worth wasn't even from Apple, but actually Disney. After Steve Jobs left Apple in 1985, he not only invested in Next, but also a small animation company called the Graphics Group. He bought the Graphics Group from George Lucas for $10 million in 1986, and this is actually what would become Pixar. The early days of Pixar were quite rough, but this would all change after the release of Toy Story in 1995. That same year, Pixar would go public at $22 a share, and it looks like the IPO hype was just as strong back then as it is today, considering that Pixar shares nearly doubled to $39 on just the first trading day. Steve Jobs owned 30 million shares of Pixar, and at $39 a share, that comes out to $1.17 billion, making Steve Jobs a billionaire. Pixar would go on to release many more blockbusters, such as Monsters Inc., Toy Story 2, Finding Nemo, and The Incredibles, significantly pushing up Pixar's valuation. In 2006, Disney would approach Pixar with an acquisition offer, and as we all know, this went through. Disney bought Pixar for $7.4 billion, out of which $3.7 billion, or 138 million shares of Disney stock, would make its way to Steve Jobs. So, contrary to popular belief, though Apple did make Steve Jobs rich in his early days and his late days, it was actually Pixar that made him a billionaire, and the vast majority of his portfolio at his death was actually Disney stock. Though Disney stock hasn't 10x'd like Apple stock, they too have grown substantially since Steve's death, growing several-fold. Steve's 138 million shares of Disney are worth exactly $25.002 billion today. Adding this to his $20.43 billion stake in Apple, Steve Jobs would be worth $45.432 billion today, placing him at about rank 27 on the billionaires list. And the funniest part is that Disney would actually still make up for the majority of his net worth today. But that's if he neither received nor purchased more Apple shares over the last decade. Steve Jobs didn't receive any Apple stock between 1997 and 2011. But that doesn't mean that he will continue to receive nothing. He didn't take any compensation because Apple was going through a tough time, and he didn't want to burden the company as much as he could. Since 2011 though, Apple has become a cash cow, profiting upwards of $60 billion per year. So they could have easily paid Steve large stock packages like they do with Tim Cook. But Steve might have declined because of principle. Even if he continued to not receive any stock compensation, he could have bought more Apple shares. Right after Steve's death in 2012, Apple would start paying out dividends, and by 2017, they would end up being the biggest dividend in the world. I'm not quite sure if Steve would have allowed for a dividend, as he likely would have preferred to reinvest that money into Apple. But maybe he would have come around to it considering how profitable Apple is. If the dividend came to fruition even with Steve leading the company, it's likely that Steve would have just used his dividend payments to buy more Apple shares, thus increasing his stake. Aside from this, with Steve at the top of Apple, it's likely that Apple would still be super innovative. Apple has managed to be extremely profitable without Steve, but they aren't nearly as innovative as before. Maybe Steve Jobs continuing to lead the company would have fixed that, making the company even more valuable today. As a result, taking into account potential stock compensation, dividend reinvestment, and greater growth of Apple stock, Steve Jobs would realistically be worth about $50 billion today, if not a little bit more. But before we end this video, there is one more scenario that we should consider just for fun. What if Steve Jobs never sold his Apple stake? In reality, it's very possible that Apple would have never launched the iPhone if it weren't for Steve's time away from Apple. And it's likely that Steve would not have gotten involved with Pixar if he hadn't left Apple. Despite this, for the purposes of this example, we'll say that he invested in Pixar anyways, and that everything at Apple progressed exactly the same way except for Steve selling his 11% stake. In such a world, he would be worth $273 billion, easily topping the billionaires list. But rage and circumstance had a different idea. Who knows though, if Steve was alive, maybe he would have liquidated his Disney stake and invested it all into Tesla in 2012, leaving him with over $300 billion today. Anyways, what do you guys think about Steve Jobs' work? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you guys thought this video provided a thorough analysis of Steve's potential net worth. And of course, consider joining our Discord community to suggest future video ideas, and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.